Okay, part 2 of copyright deals with fair use. This is section 107 of Title 17 of the U.S. Act. Fair use, the fair use doctrine, is not a right. It is a legal defense. So if you're challenged on your copyright, you're claiming fair use, you have to defend that and prove that it is fair use. It is a way of thinking about copyright permissions, but it's not a substitute for getting permissions. The purpose of the fair use document is to allow criticism, comment, news reporting, spontaneous classroom use, scholarship, and research. So why do we have fair use? Well, you need to remember that the idea of fair use is to preserve, is basically to preserve the purpose of copyright. Remember what that was? Once again, to foster creativity that will benefit society. You don't get to violate copyright just because you think it's better for society, however. Each situation will be taken on a case-by-case basis. There are 4 guiding factors that must be considered when dealing with fair use. All 4 factors must be in place to qualify as a legal defense under the fair use doctrine. So let's look at each of these 4 guiding factors. The purpose or the character of the work. The first thing to think about is if there's no money or if the work has been transformed in some way, it is more likely to qualify under the purpose and character guiding factor. It's important to remember that something that you might use in your classroom might be allowed, but if you took that same presentation or the same content and used it at a conference, that changes the whole situation and changes the purpose behind your use of that particular copyrighted information. Education, if you want to qualify under the educational purpose, you got to remember that it's got to meet your educational objectives of the course. It's not an entertainment component. For example, a full movie seldom meets the educational objectives of your course, while clips from a movie often do. Just also remember that the educational purpose in and of itself is not a guarantee of fair use. Alright, the second guiding factor that we'll look at is the nature of the work. So the more factual the article is, the more likely it is to be considered under fair use. The more creative the article is, the less likely the item would be fair use. There are other types of work, such as consumables, such as a workbook. I can't think of a case where a workbook would be, copying a workbook could be considered fair use, because it's designed to be a consumable, used for one person. So buying a copy of a workbook and asking people to make copies of it so you're not consuming it would definitely not qualify as fair use. Short stories that you get out of a newspaper or online, likely okay. A full musical score, however, not. Factual scientific articles, probably good. Important excerpts from novels or poems or modern art images are likely would not qualify under fair use. So the third factor to consider in the fair use doctrine is the amount and substantiality of the work. Small portions are likely to qualify under this particular item. Important, so it could be important and small, or large portions are likely to be not considered. So once again, the larger the portion, the less likely it's to qualify under a fair use defense. And the more important an item is, the less likely it is to qualify under a fair use defense. For example, there was the challenge to 300 words of Ford's memoirs, and it was the 300 words that the Nation's magazine published about the pardoning of Richard Nixon, which was considered the heart of the work that the courts determined violated copyright. So again, if you have a textbook and you're using a portion of that's not the heart and soul of the textbook, it might qualify, a portion of that book might qualify under fair use. Or if you have an article from a periodical, it would likely qualify under fair use. There have been different guidelines that have put out over the years, including classroom guidelines back in the late 70s. However, I find that tends to confuse matters more than anything else, since they aren't a legal defense. It's simply these 4 items that we're reviewing, and each item has to be taken on its own merit. So the 4th element is the effect on the market. Does using the item prevent the sale of a product? So you can't avoid a purchase because it's just too expensive or too much trouble, and then therefore use the work. Again, we can look at the workbook example. Will the copyright holder lose money, especially in an already established market? Printed tests software that is sold with textbooks, unless expressly permitted, the test can't be reproduced with a software program. The intent is, if the intent is modification or reproduction. Another item to consider under the element effect on the market is the spontaneous use. So if you're going to repeatedly use an item, the work becomes less likely to qualify under the fair use defense. That includes things like assembling chapters of books. As you know, if you use it one time, that's one thing, but if you're going to continue to use it, that's another. Course packs from colleges are quite a common situation here, and this applies through the K through 12 market as well. And normally there's a way of negotiating with the copyright owners and pay them appropriately for portions of their work. So once again, the 4 guiding factors in using the fair use defense: the purpose, the character of the work, the nature of the work, the amount and substantiality of the work, and the effect on the market. Other factors may come into play. Spontaneity, as we talked about, using recorded TV programs the day after it was broadcast. However, using it long term requires getting permission. Special note about software licensing: the creators of softwares own the rights and can distribute that in whatever way they see fit. There are no additional assumed rights, such as take-home teacher rights or that type of thing. So let me sum up parts 1 and 2 as it relates to copyright and fair use. First of all, it's not always easy to determine, and you must consider the ownership on a case-by-case basis. Some items are very clear, such as reproduction of workbooks. If you are going to use a fair use defense, all 4 factors of the doctrine must be met. It's important to understand that you and your school can be held liable for misuse. Fair use is a method to determine if copyright applies, and it is a defense. It is certainly not a right, and if in doubt, seek permission. So there are some additional documents that can be helpful in looking at fair use defense as far as guidelines goes related to education. For example, there is a not-for-profit educational institutions with respect to books and periodicals document. There's a guideline for educational use of music. There's guidelines for off-air recording and broadcast programming for educational purposes. And the way you get these is go to copyright.gov Note that's different than copyright.com, which is a site which is not free, but copyright.gov, by the way, copyright.com is also a good site. It's just not free. Copyright.gov has a link to the reproduction of copyright works for educators and librarians, and you'll find excellent information on page 7, 8, 9, and 22. All teachers should familiarize themselves with the guidelines. Fair use involves individual judgment, often on a case-by-case basis. So these guidelines, while not part of the copyright law itself, are intended to suggest kind of a safe harbor for you as far as guidelines goes. Personally, I think they tend to confuse it more than, and they get misinterpreted. You may need a lawyer, so in general, again, I recommend staying safe by getting permission when you can. And part of our goal here is to model best practice as far as both fair use and copyright goes. And I've included a few additional resources here. This ends part 2, and part 3 will deal with what's been happening in the last 30-40 years related to copyright.